Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Science of Reading and Middle School, the other end of the reading rope. My name is Lauren Brenner, and I'm a marketing manager here at Amplify. And just a quick reminder to make sure that you check out our change management playbook, where you can learn 5 evidence-based stages of implementation and how to effectively mobilize your people, process, and practice as your district makes the shift to the science of reading. And we'll drop that link in the chat as well, so everyone can easily click on that and download your change management playbook. And now I am thrilled to introduce you to our special guest speaker we have with us today, Deb Sabin. Deb leads Amplify's curriculum development teams for ELA. Previously, she was Director of Instruction and Training for the Writers Express. She's been an ELA teacher in a variety of classrooms, from alternative high schools to elite prep schools and international dual language programs. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deb.
Thank you, Lauren. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your very precious day or afternoon time during our after school with us. I'm really excited to be here. I would say the most important thing to know about me is that I have also been on this science of reading journey for coming up to 3 decades now, and I have had a lot of support on that journey. People like my amazing colleague, Susan Lambert. So for those of you just starting your science of reading journey, today's going to feel like a lot of information in 1 hour. I want to keep in mind these goals. This is our agenda, but beyond our agenda, I want to think about, I hope teachers will be able to use this presentation to better approach the high quality instruction materials you may already be using, or to support your own curriculum development efforts. I'm going to provide a few specific tips that hopefully you can use in your classroom, and some strategies to help you connect assessment to those needed supports. So let's get started. We're going to start with the science of reading in 2 parts. First of all, the simple view of reading, what happens in the youngest of readers up to the time they get to you, and then how those skills continue to develop as students move through middle school. Then we're going to shift to think about what are the implications for your own core instruction in the middle grades. And finally, take some time talking about how to support the struggles that students may be having. How can you identify and support those reading gaps without lowering expectations? Okay, take a deep breath and let's begin. All right. What do we mean by the science of reading? Broadly, this refers to the framework known as the simple view of reading. It's been around for a while, and it's often represented by this equation. So I'm going to pause for a minute and have you answer poll 2 and really get a pulse check on how familiar people are with this equation. So when you see that equation, language comprehension times word recognition equals reading proficiency, let me know, like, I learned this concept in my teacher training, I'm all set. Or I've seen this before, but I want to be tested on it. And finally, this looks like math and I teach literacy. Okay, it looks like we have a nice variety here. A lot of us will be learning together, but some of you may have some familiarity. So overall, this equation, or the science of reading, really focuses on how the brain learns to process words on a page. This understanding has been around for a significant amount of time now, and it has been validated a lot by research. And it can be broadly expressed, broadly I say, by this equation. Reading proficiency is the product of 2 things: language comprehension and word recognition. So the product of these 2, not the sum. What does that mean? It means something like, if we look at that word recognition box, I can read Italian words, like I can look at how they're written on a page and decode them, but I don't have anything in that left-hand box, language comprehension, to get meaning from those words I'm decoding. And if you look at something like language comprehension, I can, or a lot of us can, hear music. So we can hear the notes changing, we can appreciate the rhythm of a particular piece of music, but we couldn't look at a musical score and recognize those notes and those rhythms marked out on that score. So again, if you put a word 0 in either side of that multiplication sign, you end up with 0 on the side of reading proficiency. So what it means is that we need to be paying attention to both elements to ensure that students become proficient readers. So let's look at both briefly. Language comprehension. This is the ability to understand and make sense of spoken language. It's natural. Humans are born with areas of the brain that are dedicated to oral language development. So at birth, babies start to take in all that language that you give to them. That's called receptive language. And over time, they start then expressing that language back to you, expressing the language that's modeled for them. So we all build vocabulary and background knowledge through that receptive language. And that's how we begin to, that what goes into language comprehension. Now, clearly when students come to school, some have more background knowledge, some have more or different sets of vocabulary and more experience in the oral environment overall. This does impact them when they come to school, but all students usually, they enter school with some capacity for language. Word recognition is reading words on the page, literally the ability to see those letter shapes and translate that code into a sound, decoding. This eventually happens with automaticity, but it is not natural. So it's something that has to be built systematically. Reading instruction has to build the bridge between oral language we're wired to process and the code on the page. And it takes roughly 2 years of explicit instruction because it involves this rewiring or remapping of certain structures of the brain, moving from recognized sounds, phonemes, into specific letter patterns, phonics. So that broadly is the simple view of reading, that reading is a product of word recognition and language comprehension. So for those of you who answered that poll saying, I haven't seen this before, now you have. But it is a start. There are lots of resources available to learn more about this process. I might recommend the Amplify Science of Reading podcast. There's an episode with researcher Bruce McCandless, and he does a lot of work in this area and has an excellent presentation of this simple view of reading. Now, obviously, nothing is as simple as it looks on the surface. So when we dig in deeper into those two strands, word recognition and language comprehension, we can see that they're a little more complex than they first appear. So this is Scarborough's rope. Dr. Hollis Scarborough is an American psychologist and literacy expert focused on reading acquisition. Specifically, she works with dyslexia. And she developed this analogy of Scarborough's rope to help us think of skilled reading as resembling the strands of a rope, illustrating the interconnectedness and interdependence of all the components of both sides of that simple equation. So here you can see the two strands. You can see the language comprehension strands at the top and the word recognition strands at the bottom. The sounds we make represented by letters, and those letters in combination make up words. And equally, language comprehension is made up of our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of vocabulary. That helps us draw meaning across sentences and begin to reason and create a mental model of what we're encountering, whether in oral language or on the text. So early readers begin to use their word recognition skills to decode sentences like the one at the right. Rosa rode home in the snow. She wished that she had her gloves. And they pull on those language comprehension strands and their knowledge to understand things like, oh, the word snow probably means that it's cold. Or they start to connect that second sentence and the she, the pronoun in there, back to that actor, Rosa. All that comes together. So a reader can begin to, or even in conversation, put together a mental model, a situational model of Rosa riding, well, we don't know if it's a bike, but let's say she's riding a bike. We'd have to read more or see more to nail that down. But with that situational model, which kind of comes out of both the word recognition and the language comprehension, a reader begins to be able to infer, oh, she wishes she had gloves because her hands are cold, because it's snowing, even if the words don't say that explicitly. So she's beginning to make, the reader's beginning to inference. Those two strands come together in about third grade. So after that systematic instruction, students become increasingly automatic in their word recognition. And that allows them to put their cognitive energy into becoming increasingly strategic with those comprehension skills. Note that writing is not represented on this rope, but it is a critical part of this process. And research is pointing out that writing is an important part of developing both word recognition and language comprehension. We'll talk about that more explicitly later. So that's the down and dirty on the science of reading. Again, there are lots of good resources available to dive deeper. But what I want to do now is move into thinking about, so what do we know about what's happening with our middle school readers? So let's come into the middle. Whereas this song indicates, we know there's a lot of taking place in those middle school minds. Okay, for secondary readers entering the secondary space and moving upward, again, there is increasing automaticity with decoding and encoding. Students will still apply these skills explicitly because they're going to be encountering less familiar vocabulary and syntax. But remember, there are a finite set of phonics. So once you know that skill set, you can apply that explicitly and consistently, even as the text becomes more complex. But it is that knowledge area, and I've put a box around those knowledge strands, where readers must continue to develop and strategically apply a growing knowledge of the world, of words, and of text and sentence structures in order to get to those situational models. Because, as we all know, a lot of the sentences that students begin to encounter in their texts are no longer like that sentence about Rosa in the snow. Not having that nice decodable right there text, where a lot of the knowledge needed to kind of build that situational model is pulled from familiar words and familiar experiences. Instead, readers are kind of encountering sentences that have moved up in complexity. So there's increasingly complex syntaxes, the vocabulary is less familiar, and the sentence is drawing on more academic knowledge. So not knowledge that we might gain from everyday conversation, but also knowledge that we're starting to pull from texts in previous grades. So a sentence like this, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, is right away beginning to challenge students in terms of their knowledge of words, their knowledge of the world. So we talked about word recognition becoming increasingly automatic. Readers are still going to take a beat longer on that multisyllabic word, like proposition. You've probably seen this in your class, and you've probably done the work of kind of moving your fingers deliberately to show them those syllables. But remember, those word recognition skills that they gained in foundational reading will allow them to parse that word. The brain will need to scan the syllables and convert those syllables to sound components, and they will continue to need to practice reading fluency. But ideally, most of their cognitive energy is now able to go towards building those language comprehension strands. So let's look a little more completely at those strands. So that background knowledge, remember that knowledge was the top strand in the language comprehension part of Scarborough's rope. In the middle grades, there are many types of knowledge that students are building. So they're building their background knowledge that includes facts and concepts and academic content, like that they encounter in science and social studies. And a lot of that knowledge comes increasingly from the text they read. So there's a circular feedback loop to keep in mind here. The more knowledge students have, the more they can gain, because our brains are then able to integrate new knowledge into schema that they're that they've already created. So ideally, when a student reads that sentence about from the Gettysburg Address, there's particular knowledge activated. So they already have some familiarity with the founding fathers, the Declaration. When the teacher talks about Lincoln, there's some schema there to understand Lincoln and the Civil War. But the need for developing this type of schema does point to the first teaching implication that we'll dive into later, which is that the text and the text sequences students work with really matter because they need to keep gaining that background knowledge. The same principle is true with vocabulary, that second strand of that language comprehension section of Scarborough's rope. Students are not just learning individual words and definitions, they're beginning to map that semantic information. So they develop a breadth, depth, and flexibility to their understanding of words. When they encounter a word like proposition, they're already beginning to fit that into an existing schema and beginning to connect that word to other words. So there becomes, similar to knowledge, a reciprocal relationship between reading and vocabulary. The more students read, the more they'll be exposed to how words work. And the more they understand how words work, the more they can read. So another teaching implication we'll talk about later is, yes, it's important they work with texts that expose them to a wide breadth and depth of vocabulary. But it's also equally important that that core literacy instruction provide opportunities for them to work purposefully with those words as they encounter them. We then move on to those sections of the strands that kind of look at students pulling across sentences and text structures. So let's think about their comprehension of those types of structures. As readers move to increasingly complex text, they're encountering a wider variety of sentence and text structures. So like the long sentence from Gettysburg, that's not the type of construction we hear in everyday oral conversation. The readers need to learn how to track, perhaps with support, kind of the subject and predicate moving through that sentence. And they need to kind of parse phrases and clauses to hopefully note things like, oh, it's the nation that's dedicated to equality, not the fathers in that sentence. And ideally, they're beginning to develop knowledge of certain genres. So they start to connect, oh, I've read a speech before, and I have to start asking who's the speaker, who's the audience, what's the occasion. So again, let's note the teaching implications. Middle grade readers need to work with a range of text structures. In particular, they're going to be less familiar with informational text structures. And we want to ensure that they're not just reading these texts, but that our classrooms embed explicit work around those text structures into that reading. Because overall, we want to get back to that place where as word recognition becomes more automatic, readers can now really draw on their growing work with those knowledge strands. So again, because they still need to work with a sentence like that, to kind of pull on that knowledge of the world, the word, and the text, to build a situational model to think about, what is this sentence telling me? It's telling me something about how the nation was founded, focused on equality, and that allows them to carry that knowledge forward in the text. Okay, I have been putting a bunch of teasers about the teaching implications of all of these. And I want to make sure, again, that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. So please, if there are questions arising, put them in the chat, because hopefully we'll have time at the end to answer some of them. But now I want to think about how we structure core literacy instruction based on the science of reading, so that students are having lots of opportunity to continue to grow their automaticity with word recognition, and critically to develop and apply those critical knowledge areas of comprehension. I'm going to focus on three teaching implications. I actually think I'm focusing on 4. But teaching implication 1, the text that we select and how we select them matter. We want to choose texts that invite all students into a rich playing field where they can keep developing those skills and growing that knowledge base. And to do this, it's helpful to kind of contrast the relationship between text and skill development in the early and middle grade. For literacy teachers in early grades, their primary task is thinking about what skills do students need to build their understanding of text. But for middle grade literacy teachers, our task shifts to really thinking about what text do students need to build and apply their skills and knowledge. So let's consider how the choice of a book sets up particular opportunities for our students. So here is a text we use in Amplify's 7th grade curriculum. And let's talk about why we select this text. Phineas Gage, a gruesome but true story about brain science by John Fleischman. Well, it tells a story about a man named Phineas Gage who gets a giant rod shot all the way through his head, and yet he survives. So how middle school is that to begin with? Remains a top consideration. However, it is also a book that supports students to build a lot of interesting world knowledge about science and brain structure and early medicine, and it provides rich opportunities for them to develop word and text knowledge. So even a prompt like this that feels fairly straightforward is actually asking students to work kind of closely and critically with some of those key knowledge strands. So keep this prompt in mind as I read an early passage from the book where students are going to be able to gather information they need to answer the question asked. Afterwards, we'll talk about what you need to do as a reader to answer this question. So here's the excerpt. Remember the prompt. Based on your reading of the text, what were factors that enabled Phineas to survive? And I wish I had a professional actor reading this, but you'll have to listen to. My voice will have to do for today. Phineas should have been dead long before this. A 13-pound iron rod through the head should kill a person instantly. Surviving that, he should have died of shock soon after reaching Cavendish. He's lost a lot of blood, yet he remains awake and talkative. Even surviving the loss of blood, Phineas should have died of brain swelling. Any hard blow to the body causes injured tissues to swell. The brain is soft and the skull is hard. A hard blow to the head can rattle the brain around inside like a BB in a tin can. The rattling bruises the brain and the bruised tissue swells. The brain swells, but the skull stays the same size. A swollen brain can jam itself so tightly it will cut off its own blood supply. This swelling can choke off oxygen to parts of the brain long enough to cause permanent damage. It can also cause death. That's a closed brain injury, sometimes called a concussion. Here, Phineas has a stroke of luck. His is an open brain injury. So students are reading this passage to build their content knowledge. And you look at something like this highlighted area, you can see it's providing them rich information about concussions, how they're caused, what happens to the brain, how does that lead to injury. But the passage is also providing exposure to kind of a breadth of vocabulary words. Even a word like tissue, it might be familiar to students, but here it seems to have a different meaning. And a phrase like rattle the brain around inside, that might be surprising to them and cause them to think twice about like, what does the word rattle mean in this context? Similarly, bruises, jam, choke, it's all familiar words, but they're being used in a particular context, and the passage is stretching students' understanding of those words. And then you get to an idiom like stroke of luck, which is critical for them to understand like why it's important that Phineas had an open brain injury. But it's something that they may not be familiar with, an idiom like that. And then finally, in addition to vocabulary, the passage is asking students to unpack the structure of the text. The yellow section is largely descriptive, but you can see that Fleischman is heavily drawing on a cause and effect structure. So here's a sentence, this purple section that begins with a cause and ends with an effect. Again, another sentence beginning with a cause and ending with an effect. So in order to answer what seems like a content-driven question, readers are developing and using their knowledge of vocabulary and text structure. So again, coming back to that, thinking of that one example, we come back to that teaching implication. The texts that students work with are critical for stretching their knowledge and comprehension. But what do you want to consider as you're reviewing grade level choices for your own students? You want to think, does the text stretch the breadth and depth of their knowledge? Does it really expose them to a variety of sentence and text structures and put those things to good use? And also, what kinds of knowledge does the text help them build? Great texts help them build many types of knowledge, not just content knowledge, but knowledge of text structures to knowledge of themselves and knowledge of the world around them. And then finally, you want to think about how is that text being sequenced within the range of text they're working with. So in the example from the Amplify Grade 7 Brain Science unit, we use Phineas Gage as a jumping off point because, again, it does have this rich narrative about Phineas Gage, and students are more familiar with narrative structure. But it also allows them to begin to build a mental model of the brain and its structures. Then they move on to a section of Inventing Ourselves about the secret life of the teenage brain. That's a text that contains more academic level vocabulary and also assumes a higher level of knowledge about the brain and its structure. So now they've built some knowledge, they can apply it to Inventing Ourselves, and then move on to Oliver Sacks' case studies, further using this more advanced understanding of the brain to begin to understand Oliver Sacks' patients and where he's describing different brain damages and the behaviors associated with damages to different structures of the brain. So you want to think about that range of texts. And obviously, you know the students in front of you better than anybody. You want to think about, is that initial entry point at the right place? Or do you need to provide an entry-level text sets, either at a lower level of complexity or texts that lay out a basic groundwork of knowledge? I'm going to caution people to be a little strategic about this because limiting the time that students are working with grade level text, for example, leveling the text to their level, is not shown to have strong long-term impacts in their reading growth. So be purposeful about their entry points. Students will need explicit scaffolds and practices, but many of those can be provided while they're working with the grade level text, which brings us to teaching implication number 2. Core literacy practices need to be embedded within the context of that rich selection of text. So our instruction needs to develop their fluency, their vocabulary, their comprehension, and their writing while students are working with the text, not outside of that work. So I have a few suggestions for this. I imagine the audience in the chat, people have many more, but give students different ways to read the text. From 6th grade, maybe even through 8th grade, our oral comprehension is stronger than our reading comprehension for most students. So it's good to have them listen to key passages in addition to reading those passages and let them visualize the ideas in the text. I was just talking about how one of the key objectives for this brain science is to help students develop a mental model. Asking students to do something like diagram the effects of a closed brain injury as they're explained in the text will really help with that mental model. Don't forget, speaking and performing. Kids need to be active at this age, but those performances can also really contribute to fluency. Which brings us to my little extra teaching implication, the importance of fluency. So students are going to continue to need explicit practice gaining fluency with those longer and less familiar vocabulary words and sentence structures. Fluency, even at the word level, pronouncing and repeating those multisyllabic words, but in particular, I urge people to incorporate fluency practice with grade level text, because in small but regular doses, it can have a noticeable impact on overall reading proficiency. This has been known for a while. As early as 2000, the National Reading Panel determined that repeated oral reading practice had an impressive impact on secondary level students' reading comprehension. And actually, one of my former colleagues, Deb Reck, has a program now called Riveting Results for high school students. Again, it's forefronting fluency, and they're getting some exciting results by doing that. So let students practice the same passage, 100 to 200 words, 150 words for 5 days, 5 to 10 minutes at a time. And make sure prosody is part of the practice, not just rate and accuracy, but get them to students to review and practice and track the words they're emphasizing in each sentence. Have them highlight a particular word from each sentence that they want to emphasize, and then tie it to comprehension and ask them, why is that the word that they want readers to pay attention to in that sentence? And of course, don't neglect engagement. I've gotten a lot of feedback from teachers that talk about ways that they have discovered that fluency can be really exciting. Some of you can really make choral readings sing. That's my one dumb joke for the presentation. People have staged fluency battles and performances, make it a competitive sport. And then karaoke nights that are focused on fluency rather than on singing. So again, keeping fluency forefronted, even as we move through middle grades, can really help as they kind of really begin to encounter more complex text. Thirdly, we talked about the fact that core comprehension really needs to take into account that students need explicit practice with some of those vocabulary and text structures that they are encountering. Sorry, I just have to go back to my notes. In the passage that we read, we noticed that Fleischman's really drawing on a cause and effect structure. So work with an activity that focuses students as they're working with that passage on that text structure. Note, that doesn't mean leaving the text. I don't have to leave the text and then do some upfront work about cause and effect structure or give them particular cause and effect worksheets with an easier text. Instead, something simple like this graphic organizer gives students deliberate literacy practice using the core text. They don't have to put the text aside. And it's an easy one to differentiate, because even with embedded practices like this, we know we need to support students at different levels. So scaffolds should provide students with what they need to work with the grade level text. We want to really be kind of drawing in the biggest range of students possible. In this case, maybe those students need a supported organizer that walks them through the entire paragraph and how it uses cause and effect. Again, they're being supported to stick with the grade level text and to get to a stronger understanding of both the content of that passage as well as that new unfamiliar structure. And then finally, pay attention to integrating writing into the work students do with the text. Writing, for reasons that aren't exactly clear yet, but are becoming more clear in research, it has a strong impact on comprehension. It works to surface students' misunderstandings, but it also helps them crystallize their understandings. And it might be the best way to have students not just engage with the text, but also to practice kind of repeating some of those structures that they're reading in their writing. To develop prompts and invite students at a range of skill levels to participate, and be purposeful about the work students do with the text leading up to that prompt. Think about prompts that allow you to track the accuracy of students' understanding, so ones that ask them to explain or summarize a concept, but also craft prompts that allow for arguments and interpretations, because this shows students the many different perspectives that there can be around a text and topic, and it gives them a reason to add their voice to the conversation. And it can also be useful to give students lots of integrated writing practice at the sentence level. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you see some of this work that Judith Hoffman of the Writing Revolution has done, providing models for sentence frames that both support increasing familiarity with complex sentence structures and also develop students' content knowledge of the text. So here's a because, but, so activity where students take that passage that we read and they have to structure 3 sentences with the same beginning, but distinct transitions, and provide kind of an accurate representation of the text and those sentences in each instance. So even with that one passage from Phineas Gage, hopefully you can begin to see some of the ways that you can think about embedding core literacy practices for fluency, vocabulary, comprehension within those rich and complex sequence of grade level texts. The final teaching implication, it says 3, but I think it's 4 because we added fluency. This is not going to be a surprise to any of the folks listening. All middle grade classroom experiences need to be really centered around the critical and collaborative engagement of your students. Anyone who's walked into a middle school knows that it is a complex and energetic age. So in addition to growing their reading skills, students are doing a lot of other, probably significantly more important developmental work. Okay, maybe not significantly more important, but as important developmental work. They have important needs and preferences at this age, but the most critical for us to keep in mind here is their desire to connect with their peers. So just as literacy practice is most effective when it takes place within the context of core text, complex text, work within text has to happen within the context of that critical and collaborative engagement of your classrooms, because that goes a long way to supporting students' purpose and motivation as they're being challenged with more difficult reading. How do we do this? One activity that we love on the Amplify 6-8 team is what we call using the text as referee. The basic routine is this. You ask a student a question, like the one I asked you about Phineas, and it's a question they can only answer by using information from the text. First, they independently come up with their own answers. Then they get together to compare answers and try to convince one another that their answer is correct. So when they're having those discussions, they just almost naturally are pointing to key parts of the text. And by explaining what the text says to their peers, they refine their own understanding of the text. A lot of teachers wonder how I get my students to reread the text without it feeling like a chore. This is one way we found to do it. And the exciting thing about this one is that the text is the referee, not the teacher. The teacher's role is to, again, think about the deliberate and explicit instruction and guidelines that I, as the teacher, need to provide so the students can do this work. And if you pick a practice like this and you teach it deliberately and you do it routinely, students will continue to get stronger and more confident. Again, storyboarding or creative projects that are truly text dependent can be other ways to allow a wide variety of students to participate and collaborate around the text together. Here are a couple examples on this slide. One is from the Amplify program. It is an app that allows students to storyboard the end of Telltale Heart. So they have the text and they can drag the various images and sound effects to really try to explicitly represent what they've read in the text. And then on the right, you can see kind of a teacher sent us this photograph of work her students did reading a description in Frankenstein of the monster. And she had them kind of take that description, look at the details in that description, and map them out visually in a drawing. In both cases, students are working to translate the specific details in small passages into visual models. So those are text-dependent activities. Again, they're not to the side of the text, but a lot of kids really kind of get motivated through that type of creative work. So you want to think of critical and collaborative engagement as part of the science of reading. Students need to have purpose and motivation for this work, and critical and collaborative engagement needs to wrap around and not be at the side of that work with the text. Okay. I imagine people are, your attention may be wandering a little. It's the final section. Take a deep breath, maybe raise your arms above your head. Get the blood flowing again and catch your breath. Because I do want to spend a few minutes thinking about our increasing number of struggling readers. And what does all of this, what does the science of reading, what do the teaching implications mean for those who struggle? What should we be doing for them? I want to highlight a couple of things. It's important to continue with grade level instruction. So a lot of times when we think this kid cannot engage with grade level, our first impulse is to lower the level to make the student successful. We talked a little bit before about that can become a slippery slope. Instead, I want us to think about how we can begin to identify where comprehension is breaking down so that we can apply specific supports in that area. So continue with grade level instruction and plan for support. Every teacher knows they're going to have students who need support. Plan for that. Don't wait. But when you have students who continue to struggle, let's go back to the simple view of reading. You're trying to consider where is reading breaking down in a way that's interfering with comprehension. Because reading depends on automaticity of word recognition, and it depends on being able to understand the language of the text. And we also know that there is an issue of strategic use of knowledge, or kind of the reader's purpose and motivation. So what is it about language comprehension? What is it about word recognition? Or what is it about motivation that's impacting your reader's comprehension? So this cognitive model, developed by McKenna and Stahl, is another way to picture what needs to come together for comprehension. But even more importantly, it allows us to begin to think through when comprehension may be breaking down. You can see, if you look at the areas of this model, you can start to see the simple view of reading. You have the word recognition strands in blue, you have the language strands in green, and then equally important, you have that motivation strands in orange. We start on the right-hand side and think about what is keeping the kid from strong reading. So this model of assessment asks 4 questions. Can the student decode? So if you give that student a list of nonsense words, can they read them? Like me reading Italian words. And can you see fluency? This is where you really begin to look at fluency as the sign of solid decoding. Then you want to then move on to think about, can the student comprehend grade level language? So if they're not reading it, but I read that grade level language out loud, can they understand the syntax? Can they understand the vocabulary? And then in that orange area, you start to ask, can the student self-monitor? Do they have a strategic kind of purpose as they approach the text? Have they lost their motivation to read? This is where ideally teachers have support in their school or district. For people who are admins on this call, teachers need kind of support with assessing and understanding those gaps and creating intervention models for those gaps. It's really important in middle school because successful intervention is so possible at this age. With the caveat that while that intervention is happening, students also need to be maintaining that grade level instruction. So what do we do when we find an area of gap? I imagine that you have all seen this triangle before. The critical thing to notice is at the bottom. We really want students to continue benefiting from core instruction. So when gaps are identified that need targeted intervention, we want to make sure that there's those tier 2 or even those tier 3 supports are always additive and targeted. So another call out to admins, those in charge of the schedule, it's really important to provide time to give this additional support, but not as a replacement for grade level instruction. So we need to calendar time to give kids that double, those kids who need it, that double dose and get them back on track. Again, we are trying to reframe the issue. We're not trying to find the student's level, but we are really trying to think about identifying which is the gap that's keeping that child from being a better comprehender of that grade level text. And one of the first places that that can happen is within core instruction. So when a teacher is really aware of all those knowledge strands and starting to think about those word recognition and fluency practice, that's when you'll be able to start to kind of really identify the specific gaps in comprehension. So let's go back to thinking about what is the teacher's role in all of this. So whether you're developing your own materials or you're using high quality instruction materials that someone else has created, you as a teacher still want to really think about that sequence of text and how you can make the most of that sequence. Forefront fluency with those grade level texts and their less familiar vocabulary and sentence structures. You want to integrate into students' work with those texts, strategic and deliberate practice with those critical comprehension areas of world knowledge, word knowledge, and text knowledge, and really kind of help them think about what is the situational model that they're building and how are they able to inference using that model. And finally, I want you to think about how all students can participate in that practice. So the more students can do this work, the more you'll get a sense of what your students are able to do, and also start to be able to identify those specific gaps where you'll be able to provide more targeted support and practice to keep building their knowledge and skills. All right, we got through all 4 sections with probably 5 or more minutes to answer some questions. I'm very excited about that. This is the first time I've had whole 5 minutes for questions. Oh, I'm getting a lot of thumbs up.
I was watching the clock for you, Deb, but there certainly are a wonderful number of questions that came in, so we can certainly dig in. Before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much to you, Deb, for this wonderful and insightful presentation. You can certainly see how insightful it was by the conversation going on in the chat. So much rich discussion
I couldn't
and so
see
much
that at
wonderful
all. I'll look now.
questions. And without further ado, let's just jump into some of those questions since we have about 5 minutes or so before we conclude before the top of the hour. So one question that came in from multiple people, what do you recommend for students who are behind with phonics and phonemic awareness and the foundational skills?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to really incorporate that fluency practice, because for whatever reason it seems to jumpstart a lot of those skills, or maybe kind of give a bump to whatever skills students have. However, you do need to begin to, as we looked at that cognitive model, think about where those gaps are. So Dibbles, Orff, and Mays are kind of good screeners to let you know if your grades 6 through 8 students need to work on foundational skills to kind of get a sense of where they are with their word recognition skills. And then don't neglect the role of those comprehension skills. So again, there is a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of developing a really strong screener for middle school students. But MOCA, coming out of the University of Oregon, is an assessment that's beginning to show a lot of promise as a comprehension diagnostic. So it assesses kind of distinct types of comprehension, causal inferences, paraphrases, bridging inferences, and lateral connections. You can look it up, MOCCA. It is not, it's also like another, there's an assessment for cognitive dementia that has the same name, but make sure you're looking at the one for literacy. Um, and that is one that kind of will start to help us understand, like, where is comprehension breaking down apart from kind of what we know are good screeners for those early word recognition skills. Hope that answered the question.
That was great. All right, for another question from Tonya, what considerations do you suggest for students who are multilingual learners? And I saw a few questions or a little bit of conversation throughout your presentation about this topic as well.
Yeah. So obviously, we have increasing number of multilingual learners. Again, like, I think fluency is a way to put language in a very like specific 100 words that they are hearing and then practicing saying, even if they don't know the meaning of those words, they could begin to work with that. Some of that visual work that we were talking about, really kind of helping them put together or give them kind of an organizer that looks like the brain divided into structures, and then kind of help them with, on the outside, a sense of what are the passages that they're trying to map into particular parts of that structure. So kind of visual, auditory, really thinking about, obviously with a lot of those words, particularly for Spanish speakers, really thinking about the cognates. So if you're looking at that critical text vocabulary, which ones are false cognates or which ones are familiar cognates, and thinking about that. So drawing on the language skills that they already have are some of the suggestions that I would make. But again, really helping, trying to find the ways for them to participate as much as possible in that grade level instruction. They will need, we talked about those on ramps into that text, they will need additional on ramps. And often it might be like a short couple of short couple of paragraphs, ideally translated into their language, that begins to ground some of the knowledge that will help them enter into that text about Phineas Gage, for example.
Great. We have time for probably one or two more questions. So let's see what we got. Do you have any suggestions for students who are unable or unwilling to write? This question came in from Christina.
Yes. I have a lot of experience with students that are unable or unwilling to write, just because I came to Amplify from an organization that really focused on integrating writing into core instruction. And so you have to focus on productivity, right? If students are not writing, they cannot benefit from writing. So really starting small with like one or two sentences, and then building a specific routine around writing. So just like with that use the text at referee, in Amplify, we have a particular writing routine that's followed by a sharing routine, and kids know exactly how it's going to work each time, and they can kind of see their productivity increase, rather than really focus initially on kind of, can they control all the conventions of their sentences. We focus explicitly on productivity, and can they kind of focus on one moment or one thing. So we begin with narrative writing. Can they write from one moment from lunch today? Maybe like, I opened my peanut butter and jelly sandwich and took 2 bites before I had to sneeze. Great. And we give targeted feedback right away. Like, gosh, like that must have been awkward in the cafeteria sneezing. Those details really help me picture what's happening in that moment. So starting small and understanding that kind of those routines and that targeted feedback allow students to over time build up that productivity muscle.
And once again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today for this wonderful presentation. And of course, to you, Deb, for joining us today to present to everyone on this and providing your insight on this topic. Before we all hop off, I just wanted to give a quick shout out for our Science of Reading, the podcast. We are coming up on 5 million downloads, so thank you to all of our listeners. We've just kicked off season 8. This season, we're talking all about knowledge, why it's so critical for literacy development, and how it can be most effectively built. So subscribe today. We drop episodes every other Wednesday, so our next episode comes out next Wednesday, November 7th. Is that next Wednesday? Or the 8th, whatever the next Wednesday is.
It'll already be November. Sorry.
I don't know. And just a quick reminder, we have an upcoming webinar on November 6th, defining math fluency, what fluency really means and why it matters. And that's being presented by Amplify's Math Teacher Lounge podcast co-host, Bethany Lockhart Johnson. She's also an elementary educator. So feel free to register for that, and we hope to see you there as well.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed spending time with you. Maybe I'll see some of you at NCTE in November. Until then, have a really happy Halloween.
And thank you so much again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.